Mr. Kshirsagar, Dr. Mukherjee, Dr. Doshi, Saru Doshi, Dr. Devangna Desai, and friends, you are present in such a large number here this evening for my talk. So I'm very, very pleased and thank you for coming here. It's a kind of alma mater for me in that sense that when I grew up in Bombay. So when I was a student at St. Xavier's College in Bombay and doing ancient Indian culture, my master's, that time Dr. Moti Chandra was the director of this museum, and he was also a professor for postgraduate studies. So we used to come to this museum for his lectures. He was officially appointed as a teacher for that. And that time I used to come to this museum, and it was a great pleasure to be learning from Dr. Moti Chandra. And Saryu would remember, she used to occasionally drop in the classes and things. And that time, my memory goes to very dark and dingy staircases, the museum. So I didn't go beyond the class where Dr. Moti Chandra used to take just next door to his office, and except that the museum was not frightening, but uninteresting. So from then, and then later on I shifted to Delhi and set up the National Crafts Museum, etc. But after that, when I came here, the transformation that I've seen of this museum is so amazing, it's exemplary, and therefore the credit goes to, of course, Dr. Mukherjee and a couple of his immediate predecessors. They have begun the work, but it's carried on. And I must say that all of you Bombayites must be proud that what is going on here and what is going to happen, I'm told here, this will become really a major hub in Bombay for culture and things. And in an urban, in a city, to find this as a center, I think it is going to really be a very revolutionary and very kind of something that will define things that for next generation as well as for everybody else. So really congratulations to all who are involved and to Dr. Mukherjee for doing this. And now my topic is too long, and it is almost a material of 3 lectures: cotton, indigo, and opium. And I'm trying to compress it, but I hope I might need a little bit time. But since the next one is an exhibition, perhaps they can wait for 10 minutes if I overshoot the time. This material is partly a kind of work in progress. In the sense, I've done on cotton some work, and occasionally I gave lectures at Museum Society also on cotton. Indigo is somewhat new material, but opium is completely new, and Bombay city and opium has extraordinary connection that everybody knows. But I'm all 3 topics. You see, I'm talking about each topic initially, introducing the trade and the money and the global circulation of commodities, exchanges. It was an extraordinary period, 18th, 19th century, when the world woke up to other world, outside their own world, the Western world, woke up to that, and then museum collections began, a lot of things happened. So this circulation of knowledge and circulation of commodity was an amazing period. And I think that I'm not so much, I will give introduction to the trade and all that, but I'm more interested in what all these do to culture as such, cultural things and cultural exchanges and things like that, and how ideas went along with the object. We separate material objects from ideas, but ideas were traveling along with it, parallel to the objects. And that is the main contention of my talk this evening. I try and do a little bit faster, but still I might need a little more time. So I read a bit, then I'll explain a little bit, then read, so I'll save some time. Indo-British cotton trade and global slavery. Now, there itself the title would tell you that Indian cotton fabric, before the coming of mills in Lancashire, there was a huge export of Indian cotton to Britain and from there elsewhere. Now this has a lot to people we know about that. History is well known, but what is not so well known is its direct connection to global slavery, and this is what sort of bring into focus the cultural aspect and entire world's economy and ecology and things like that. So I'll read a bit, two passages, then we'll talk again. Before the end of the 15th century, Indian cotton fabric was exported to Europe via the Arabian Sea and the Arab land route. Arabs have a lot to do with, Arab trade had a lot to do connecting Europe and India. And also the whole Mediterranean area and things like that. Even the word cotton comes from kutun, Arab word kutun. So there are so many, this is just a minute example, but there are so many things that can linguistically and culturally. So land route through a chain of cultivators, agents and traders. With the discovery of India through the sea route by Vasco da Gama at the end of the 15th century, Europeans began to have direct access to Indian cotton goods. Until then, it was through the Arabs. Arabs continued the trade afterwards, but the major trade happened after. As observed by Sven Beckert, I don't know if you know this book. It is called The Empire of Cotton. It's an extraordinary book that has come out by a British professor. The Empire of Cotton is, when you read it, it's amazing that you know the insights of this trade and its effects. As observed by Sven Beckert, as early as 1621, the East India Company imported an estimated 50,000 pieces of cotton goods into Britain. Just 50,000 pieces in 1621. Whereas by 1766, that is little over 100 years, cotton cloth constituted more than 75% of East India Company's export to Europe. So look at in little more than 100 years, how cotton began to play such a big role, and India was at the center. And I'm not talking of raw cotton, I'm talking of finished fabric. And that is what Gandhi called afterwards khadi. But Gandhi didn't invent khadi. What cloth we had was only khadi, because it was all hand spun and hand woven. Handloom came much afterwards. So now coming to the furtive histories that I'm talking about, the strange histories of cotton. How many of us would know that the Indian cotton fabrics were at the center of the British slave trade from Africa? That is, and then that slave trade right up to Middle America and growing of coffee and sugarcane, that entire thing, the whole world economy rotated around that slave trade. The basic was Indian cotton material. Most of the Indian calicos were banned in the United Kingdom to protect their wool and silk and linen weavers by the Calico Act of 1700. Because to protect the interest of wool weavers, the government in Britain passed a law that was called Calico Act of 1700. As such, the Indian calicos were directly exported from UK to Africa, where the British merchants bought slaves in exchange of Indian textiles. This is heavily recorded in the company records, as well as generally in histories of cotton and things like that. Now, why was Indian cotton going to Africa? Why to Africa particularly? On this issue, it is observed that the deportation of millions of African slaves to the Americas in exchange of Indian cotton created pressure to secure more cotton cloth from India. So because so much was the demand, so the income was double. One side, they were earning by buying slaves and selling slaves at very expensive price into middle and southern part of America and the world over, as well as earning from the cotton import. So when the Calico law came, they stopped importing cotton, but they directly exported to Africa from there, because two reasons, I'm coming to that. As Africans preferred cloth made in India, European traders even exported cloth made in Europe in imitation of Indian cloth under their Indian names, so that the Africans would think that it is authentic Indian. It may also be noted that the European re-export of colorful Indian textiles to Africa also had a racial dimension. Color. Color means the other. We are not color, but others are color. So, had a racial dimension, namely the Western fear of color. They're frightened of it. Was some kind of chromophobia, we can call it, afraid. And color meaning the other. We are not colorful. Others are colorful. And that fear of color, chromophobia, as agent of the ethnic otherness, meaning if you're colorful, you are ethnically other. That is a symbolism involved, not only symbolism, but a cultural kind of tenet involved. The colorful Indian cotton textile served as agency for social discrimination as observed by the German thinker Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe's color theory is very famous. Goethe's color theory is really a basic thing about color. And Goethe says, man in a state of nature, meaning tribals or aboriginal or something, man in a state of nature, uncivilized nations, maybe India, and children, we are in Children's Museum, and children have a great fondness for colors in their utmost brightness. So it's a kind of, color is something, so that is an important thing that he said, and this really sums up of that period's ideology about color and colorful Indian textiles and their export and thing. Then eventually, next please. Yeah, just hold for a second because I forgot to say. Now here on the top right you see the early Europeans believed that the sheep producing cotton grew on trees, and the term tree wool in German, so Baumwolle. And so they thought the sheep grew in India and that produced cotton. So it's a 1356 drawing of their imagination of cotton. On the left side, the Arab traders, British ships in the background, and these crates are ready to export and they are examining textile. And then, of course, the Europe's idea of belly dance, etc., and Orientalism in general. Next, please. Yeah. Slave labor employed globally in cultivation and processing of cotton, coupled with the invention of cotton processing and weaving machinery during the Industrial Revolution. Two things, slave labor and invention of Industrial Revolution, cotton processing, spinning, etc., led to the colossal industrialized production of cotton cloth in Lancashire. So first they were importing from India, but later on it led to their exporting, and how much? By 1880, about 4,16,000 acres of global land was needed to cultivate cotton to feed the cotton mills of Lancashire, and ironically, India became the largest importer of the British mill fabric. So far, so good, but look what happened further, and why I said furtive histories. That is something interesting. Now here you can see on your left below just a view of an early spinning mill, mule in the Industrial Revolution. On top there is a cartoon, and the owner of cotton business says, well, yes, it is certain that cotton is more useful to me than wool. And this is the attitude led to the 1700 and the Calico Act. And this is a folder in which samples produced in Manchester and Glasgow and other places were sent to India, copies of Indian fabrics. So this is what, so the tables were turned. First they imported, now India got. But how did we get this? Even worse. Textile manufacturers of India, next please. Textile Manufacturers of India by John Forbes Watson. I don't know how many of you know about John Forbes Watson's volumes. It's an amazing thing. I think in Bombay, I don't know about the Asiatic Society, but the only place where these 18 volumes are, are in the library of Bhaudaji Art Museum. It's unbelievable kind of work that was produced by Forbes, and these 18 volumes had 700 original samples of Indian textile. So you see here, these are all original, not produced in Manchester, etc., but were Indian fabric. And he created details of everything, the dye, the printing, where it is manufactured, everything Forbes did. And for years and years, this was considered to be, and perhaps even today, the finest documentation of traditional Indian textiles, various techniques and so on. But what happened was that there was something furtive about it. That the advent of willful production of counterfeits of traditional handcrafted Indian brocades, ikars, block prints, bandhanis, leheriyas, now rolled out from the mills of Lancashire and exported to India, which led to the destruction of the centuries-old intangible aesthetic heritage. So this is what all traditional techniques were, because these were roller printed and were exported. John Forbes Watson, a cotton botanist, produced 18 volumes, as I told you. Now, these are very admirable work. But what happened here, people don't read the introduction for which these volumes were created. And I quote one sentence from him. India is, listen carefully, India is in a position to become a magnificent customer. For to clothe but a mere percentage of such a vast population would double the looms of Lancashire. So he wanted these to be reproduced as close as possible. If we attempt to induce a nation to become a customer, we endeavor to make the articles which we know to be liked and needed, and these we offer for sale. And that's what happened afterwards from what came to India. And India was the largest importer of textiles, and that time we were the largest exporter. These Manchester textiles, I'm surprised nobody has collected them. Jain manuscript covers and things, all covered with this, and lining of many things and quids that people were using. And so the only person who has collected it systematically in Bombay is Praful and Shilpa Shah. They have a major collection of Manchester textiles. Next, please. Because I'm trying to save time to hurrying up a little bit. So these we have seen. These are shown already. Are they? So next, please. Yeah. Now, machine-produced European copies of Indian handcrafted temple hangings. So even pitchwise and things were roller printed. So you see there is a module. Now this is one module, this is another module. It's same module but roller printed, and therefore, so Vaishnav pitchwise here and there, these are all produced in Manchester. And this is a pitchwise produced in Germany, industrially produced copy of Indian crochet work temple hanging pitchwise, probably made in Saxony, Germany, 19th century, and the detail of that. Then next, please. Now this is a Lancashire print version of Indian handcrafted fabric. You see on top left is a detail of a hand embroidered Ahir community skirt from Kutch. This is actual examples of example of embroidery, and right side you see a detail of a Lancashire roller printed version of A, that is on your left. And these are all copies of different techniques by which things were woven, etc., and that began to come. If you see the collection of Shilpa, I also have a few things, and some of my things are now in Kiran Museum, but these were like they completely brought a social change, and communities had a custom. One community, particularly village communities, they would wear only one particular design. So thousands of saris or odnis particularly would be sold to a particular community. All this was kept in mind by Watson and other people, and that's how production was made. Extraordinary, cleverly manipulated trade. Next, please. Now, there is important aspect, visual culture of Indo-British textile trade. Now, along with the textiles that came here and what went from India and thing, there was a large amount of visual culture of Indo-British textile trade. In the sense, like you can see here, when the Manchester or Glasgow or other textile came to India, I showed you the sample folder. And on that, these kind of labels were pasted. And like this is from Kettlewell Bullion and Company, very major exporter to Calcutta, but also Bombay. And left side also similar thing and thing. So now you can see on the right side there is more a social thing. A couple together, a married couple on a mill label. On left side there is a goddess. So religious objects, social life, many things were, and this whole perhaps Victorian ideal of married couple, together, so many things converge into this. Next, please. Yeah, the visual publicity material of Lancashire textile goods, use of Hindu religious imagery, and of Royal British endorsements. Now, this is extremely important. I pause on this for a while. That who had access, maybe even 50, even today, not everybody has access to the temple. Many communities are not allowed to enter Hindu temple. So there was, many Hindus were left out of that. What major came, certain communities. And suddenly when these images began to come, this label, Hindu gods were reproduced, mythological stories, etc., reproduced, and these actually became objects of worship. That is quite interesting. And because this one could take from anywhere. Colorful printing, Ravi Verma press, these all came later on. And when they came, I think there was some kind of democratization of Hindu printed image. This brought a revolution and brought access to gods and goddesses in Hindu mythology to ordinary people. And this revolution came with printed images that came on top, all three images on top you can see. And I have seen, for example, even why certain communities, even in places like Shekhawati, I have seen these enlarged and printed in the wall painting or framed, and actually vermilion dots were put on that along with other things. That means that these became, the mill labels became objects of worship. Because that time, nothing of that sort was available. An image was not available to an ordinary person as such. So this was the first introduction to have an image, an interaction with an image, and how, you see how trade and things are converging into this. So the European mills and their agents began to paste attractive multi-chrome labels on the bales of textiles exported to India, having images of Hindu gods and goddesses endorsing that. So the gods were endorsing the product. So the British textile, when you found an image of a deity, it was as if endorsed by the deity that it's a good product, so to say. These labels boosted marketing of their cloth as they became collectibles and objects of domestic worship. So many framed things. I have acquired myself at least 25, 30 from Shekhawati alone, framed pictures with vermilion marks and things like that. This also democratized access to Hindu deities across the caste lines. Now what about the lower three images? In India, when something from the royal family was there, it was also an endorsement. Once I was working, I'm an anthropologist, I was working in tribal areas, and as you all know that many tribals, they had always necklaces made of coins, silver coins. So they just strung together. So I asked somebody, why do you have this British silver coins? And they said, because we can trust the British silver standards. Whereas when we go to silversmiths here, gold, then we don't know whether we are getting white metal or silver. So the credibility of British royals was very big. And here on the left side there is Queen Victoria, Prince Albert here. And here it's very interesting. Queen Victoria is holding a baby and two Indian guards around her, and the baby is India. So she's nurturing India. India was anyway one of the most favored colony of the British. This new exposition of visual imagery also influenced the. Now this is important. This new exposition of visual imagery also influenced the sartorial norms of personal and social identities. It changed clothing, etc. Now I will show you those images, that how our sari underwent a transformation, how clothing completely underwent transformation, ushering in modern fashion and aspiration. So colonial modernity or our modernity started with colonial modernity, how this new visual culture played a role in that, while also giving push to Swadeshi movement. There also there was a role played here. Next, please. The aesthetic turn from khadi to handloom. As is well known, Gandhi's idea of khadi was devoid of any aesthetic considerations. However, a strong urge began to be felt either to aestheticize khadi or opt for handloom. It's on record that when Nehru was in jail and he wrote to his father Motilal that he wanted two pairs of kurta and pajama. And Motilal, for his son, he sent him the best possible, thinnest and most comfortable khadi kurta and thing. So it is on record that Jawaharlal said, but the purpose of khadi is not to have it as luxury. But then he said, Kripalani wore even finer, and then he retained the kurta and pajama sent to him. Now, people like Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Kamala Nehru, Sarojini Naidu, Rukmini Devi Arundel, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and Pupul Jaikar endeavored to revive traditional sari genres through the handloom movement. Now, because khadi had no beauty, it was essentially supposed to be devoid of beauty, but were not supposed to. It had a different purpose. So they, brought this new. And Sarojini Naidu, in her biography, there are repeated mentions that she told Gandhiji that I will not go to the round table conference, etc., wearing your thick khaddar. I'm going to wear my kanjivaram or things like that. So many references are there. So they were all interested. So all kanjivaram, Banaras, these, that, were all revived through handloom. But keep in mind, please, that what you are buying today as a brocade or these or jamdani or something is not the same as pre-khadi, because handloom means hand spun and hand woven. Now what we are buying is machine spun yarn and hand woven. So the weight is different. The twist, when machine spun yarn is used, the twist is very different. So you take an old patola, for example, 150 years old patola, hold it in one hand and hold today's patola, however best workmanship, you will see the difference of weight, because there was low twist yarn that was used. So after the coming of, even when handloom was revived, and best possible handloom sarees are nowadays available everywhere, if you're concerned with feeling of that on your body, I think it's a different product. That means it is forever, it is over, even when produced in India, and even if it is woven on handloom. Next, please. When I drink water, have a look. You already know what's happening here. Colonial modernity and transformation of the Indian sartorial culture. As I said, that I may talk about trade histories, but my focus is on cultural transformation, exchanges world over, commodities, ideas circulating, Arab world, many things. This was an amazing period for us to get into modernity. Revival of tradition as modernity which had both aesthetic and nationalist connotations, led to several experimentations, including adding the petticoat and accompanying the blouse styles derived from Western gowns, frocks, and blouses. What I'm trying to say is that originally, Indian sari, nowhere in the country from north to south, petticoat was ever worn. It was just a wrap around. Petticoat came under the influence of, and these all images that came, a lot of them came from Europe, a lot of them influenced, as you can see here. So example, blouse. There was most part of India, blouse was never worn at all with sari, even in aristocratic family. It came later on, and the aristocratic families had more direct contact with the British. But actually, in most places, blouse was not worn. So, frock and gown, taking elements like puffed sleeve or things like that, say puff sleeve or long sleeves or frilled sleeves or deeply plunged neck, all these elements came from European clothing and got imbibed into sari. And therefore, sari underwent. So now you can see, now this is a European image, large size. So, there was a company called B. Rigold and Bergman. They were biggest publishers of this. They were a British company, but based in Singapore, and they exported to India thousands of such images. And from that, a cultural transformation, besides religious, was happening. These images became the ideal for fashion. I'm surprised that no fashion institution in our country, what do they have in terms of resource to tell the transformation, how modernity came into fashion, in Indian fashion? How are they teaching? I mean, there's no other visual material except this kind, and maybe a few photographs of 19th century family albums and things like that, which are certainly a source. But this company, for example, they were selling prints in India. Here, look at the sleeveless, this blouse style with a kind of frill. Here is another kind of style, but they're all combined with sari. And this is like European idea of an oriental dressing and things like that. So, and these were very important. These were all swatch folders, but on each of them there was an image of a European woman. So this was bringing a silent revolution in fashion, till when Air India added a dimension to sari later on. That's another topic of interest. Now, as the return journey of the magic carpet from Britain brought along with its cargo of Manchester textiles an array of images of exotic white women on their product labels, they in turn begin to shape the social values of urban Indians in various ways. Now I have a quote, and I'm sorry, it is in my notes, but I have not managed to get the author. But it's not my quote, but it is either from Lata Mani, she has written a book on this, or it is from perhaps Sheila Reddy, I don't know. But I'll read the quote, it's very interesting. Men begin to dream up wives and mistresses in the image of the white woman. Women responded by sensualizing their attire and wearing short hairstyles. While so pleasing their men, they also relished the newly found freedom to allure and entice. I need not read it again, but how things were entering. And then there was, here. Here is a prince, and he's sleeping and dreaming, and here is a white woman. He just sort of dreaming of, so to please the, So there's so much. This is nothing. What I'm showing you is 0.some% of the collection I had. I had 150, which are now in Kirana, the museum. of these labels and take these swatch folders and things. But look at the styles, and this is early Indian modernity, sartorial thing, directly related to exports of British textile to India. Next, please. Nationalist clothing, the popular response. Besides that, in people's life and nationalism. Bengal was the original home of the Swadeshi movement, which began around 1905 and which adopted Bankim Chandra's song Bande Matram, which he in his book Anand Math, first time the song appeared, became very popular. So Bande Matram as its slogan. That was all. So Swadeshi movement began before Gandhi, don't forget, and it started in Bengal. Its nationwide impact was so strong that it began to be woven even on everyday clothing. Around that time, the visual image of Bharat Mata or Mother India too was conceptualized as, now listen, sari clad mother evoking imaginary ancient tradition and a sort of Hindu land. It's a map, so land, Hindu map, Hindu land. It began to appear on Indian mill labels as a counter to the imported British mill fabric. So Swadeshi mills and many other Indian mills, they began to also produce these labels and thing. And here there is a trident and a saffron flag and things like that. So some kind of idea of Hindu land already that time. There was a student of mine called Sanjay Ghosh, and he wrote a student's paper, and I was examining it, and I read a beautiful sentence he wrote in JNU. A consent in this kind of Bharat Mata, a consent of sorts was achieved by dissolving regional styles of dressing into national style. One style. There are some, South India, everywhere there are regional styles. But these are all dissolved into one nation. So imagine the unity in diversity. So many other things are evoked by this image that is and very well clad, covered against what I showed you, the European image. So all sorts of things were happening that time. Now, this is an old Baluchar sari, about 19th century. And then later on, early 20th century, in Baluchar, they began to weave saris in which in the border, yes, here for example, you can see, in Bengali it is woven Vande Matram, Vande Matram, Vande Matram. So by that time, Swadeshi movement was gaining ground, and simultaneously Baluchar and all, where there were images of European sahibs and mem sahibs and railway trains and etc. began to go in the background, and then Baluchar anyway was slowly stopping producing that kind of saris with European imagery. But this movement, when it began, this kind of thing started to happen. In this particular skirt also, you can see brocade skirt woven with nationalist flag, a national flag, Rajasthan 19th century, and this is from CSMVS collection. Here again, brocade sari woven with Vande Matram, and this I have already spoken about. Next, please. Now I come to Indigo. Here I'll skip a few things because I want to come to Opium, which is my new work. The allure of Indigo and its dark tales. Indigo is a vat dye. There are only a couple of vat dyes. What is a vat dye? You see, indigo is basically not a dye. It's a pigment. So pigment gets washed off, generally. So in Ajanta painting, in Mughal painting, you will find indigo used all over the world. I think indigo was used as a pigment. But if you dip a cloth in a pigment and you wash, it will be washed out. So the pigment needed to be converted into dye. It's a little bit of technical thing, but I thought I should mention and we should know. It's a good knowledge to have. So indigo mixed water, which is pigment, they put the dyers put they put alkaline into that, and therefore they reduce it. Reducing is a chemical term. Reducing means deoxidization. So they deoxidize, then becomes a dye, and when the cloth is dipped into it, the dye piles up on it. And when you take out the cloth, I've seen it many times in the air, first it looks normal off-white, and in front of your eyes within 10 minutes it becomes as blue as this. So, slowly it gets re-oxidized. It's a chemical process. But imagine more than 1,000 years ago, this process was known world over, that turning a pigment into dye, which is, I think, and the only artist I know, contemporary artist, who used it as a pigment, as a dye in painting is Francesco Clemente. He was working for many years in Pondicherry. He's a very renowned American artist, and he used to work with a thick Pondicherry paper, and he used to dip that paper in indigo vat, because you can't. He could have used it as pigment, but he wanted to have these various shades and things like that. So, this is like interesting background today. Next, please. Now coming to, as I'm in the theme of my furtive histories, indigo's global diffusion and espionage. There was so much espionage around indigo because it was so valuable. The business was in billions of pounds business all over the world, indigo. Interestingly, as early as the 17th century, Spain snatched the knowledge, meaning espionage, snatched the knowledge and trade in Asian indigo from the Portuguese, who were the earliest here, Portuguese, and developed its plantation and processing by their slave labor in their Central American colonies. So this is already 17th century. Huge, large plantation of indigo. Through their success, they cornered most of the Western European indigo market, marginalizing the British, who were also present there, but British were somehow marginalized. Notably, around 1820, the French government engaged itself in espionage of the British cultivation and processing of indigo in Bengal with the objective of its production in their African colonies. 5, 6 years, 7 years ago, I was working in the British Library for my research, and lunchtime I just told library staff that I'm looking for whatever you have on indigo. When I came back from my lunch, I found a file lying on my table, and when I opened, extremely beautifully handwritten 45 pages with beautiful pen, and this was in French, so I couldn't read. But fortunately, there was a small typed note. British Library. So they put a note there saying that this is a French report of French espionage on the British in documentation of indigo, how it is cultivated, how it is processed. Processing of indigo is extremely complex thing. So the French were, so this was the espionage report, except that paragraph I had nothing with me. A year or year and a half, I chased this report and thing, and I found out that there was a person from Holland. He had translated this and published from Bangladesh. It took me another 6 months to find out from Bangladesh where was it published, but I got that book, and it's such an amazing documentation done from the viewpoint of planting indigo. So the accuracy had to be, technical accuracy had to be very good, because you were not just art historical documentation. I'm not saying that art historians are not accurate, but what I'm saying is that this was technically a very good documentation. So notably around 1820, the French government engaged itself in espionage of the British, I told you this, Central American. And so what was happening, that eventually the Central American indigo production began to decline eventually, on account of the farmers replacing indigo by other cash crops such as coffee, sugar, cotton, tobacco. These were, Central American crops, and they turned towards that because they earned more money. So indigo was sidelined, and then there were slave revolts and a lot of other things that were happening. So the British had to look for somewhere else. Next, please. No, there must be one before. Yeah, Indigo's homecoming to Bengal. So when this was happening, the British were sort of marginalized. So they looked to Bengal. Now, Bengal had known indigo, but that scale of indigo production wasn't there. At this juncture, the British turned to their colonial territory in Bengal for large scale indigo plantation, importing, look at this irony, importing experienced planters which had gone from India, but the seed quality had improved over decades. Importing experienced planters and superior quality of seed from West Indies, from the West Indies, which led to phenomenal success to the extent of producing nearly, listen to it, 70 lakh pounds of indigo annually. The British started to produce, and this was cultivated on nearly 1 million acres of land and processed in about 2,000 British company owned factories, like this, small factories, big, and and then kind of processes that 2,000 such factories. Even today, if you go to Bihar and Bengal, you will find a couple of such factories still there, empty, but you know what process it involved, and So this was homecoming of indigo to Bengal. Next, please. Luminous. Now I come to the cultural ramifications of indigo. In order to maximize the harvest, the British planters resorted to forcing the farmers to grow indigo while paying the lowest price for the crop. And they were forced, they were not allowed to cultivate anything else on certain lands. Exploitation and torture by the planters. The planters were the normally British, but otherwise wealthy Indians, and but mainly British, and they tortured farmers to the extent that Gandhi came to Champaran because of the complaint, and Gandhi was not known in India before that. So this whole history is related to that. Planters, and then planters goons became, exploitation and torture by the planters goons became rampant, and the resultant large-scale uprising of the indigo workers led to what is known as Blue Mutiny or Blue Rebellion of 1859, when that time the farmers really refused to. A powerful reflection of the situation, now coming to its cultural ramification. A powerful reflection of the situation had found expression in the play. There was a play written called Neel Darpan, and the play was written by Dinbandhu Mitra. This play was translated into English and was staged, and translation was done by the famous Bengali writer Michael Madhusudan Dutt with the help of an Irish priest, James Long. James Long was in the center of intellectual life of Calcutta in 19th century. Performances, writers, he was really a very important figure in the cultural life of Bengal in that period. So they both translated, and Long had to pay a price. I'll come to it. When the scene of an English planter in this play attempted to rape a peasant woman, there was a commotion and protest by the European spectators present in the audience. The play was then cancelled by the magistrate, and the troupe was asked to leave Lucknow when this was being staged in Lucknow. The then Viceroy Lord Northbrook legislated the notorious Dramatic Performances Act of 1876, a very renowned act, for keeping control over the control over the construed seditious theatre practices in India. And at that time, James Long was imprisoned for a short while and was fined. And I don't know about Michael Madhusudan Dutt, what happened to him, but they were really, but Long would not bend. astonishingly, the act is still valid in India. That's the interesting thing, that this act still exists, control or whatever theatre act in India today. Of course, with amendments, but in some states even more stringent. So it's called the same. The name of the act is still there. Besides the horrors of, so this is one aspect of horror and cultural ramification. Besides the horrors of cultivation, processing indigo in the British factories was immensely hazardous. As observed by a 17th century French traveler, Tavernier, he writes, the workers who worked at this for 8 or 10 days, you see their workers are working, and there is on top, there is here the British officers are watching that they work properly. The workers who work, this is a photograph, the workers who worked at this for 8 to 10 days would spit blue for some time after work. An egg placed near a person working on indigo vat would at the end of one day be found to be altogether blue inside. This is what Tavernier is recording. Even if there is slight exaggeration, I think the evil effects were there. I'm skipping one part and only reading one aspect of it, that in the closing years of 19th century, indigo was synthesized by the German chemist Bayer and Adolf von Bayer, and he wrote to a friend that please come to the inauguration or unveiling of a sculpture, and you don't have to wear next please. Yeah. So Adolf von Bayer, he wrote a letter to his friend, and he said tie and tails are necessary, but no other formalities. And then he said indigo is, and that's the formula. So this formula completely transferred. In that time, it was at a point of time when India was still exporting annually about 8 million kilograms of indigo, and the fate of this natural dye was overnight with the sealed in 1870 synthesization of indigo. Now I come to opium. Now can I take, yeah, okay. Now come to this is my new area of work. The two others I've done some work earlier. We come to opium. Next, please. Yes. Opium, the black gold. Before coming to the vast global cultural ramifications of the colonial Indo-Chinese opium trade, let me provide you a quick peep into its sly histories. Though the consumption of opium in India goes back to the early medieval times, when in all probability it was introduced into the country by Arab merchants. So this is, for example, a painting, a detail of a wall painting in Jamnagar, old palace in Jamnagar, where people, the tools here used, they show that it's not bhang, it is opium, the way it is mixed. There are many such implements available in the market, in antique market. So they are all drinking opium and things like it, so wall painting. So it was consumed. And I remember when I used to do field work in Saurashtra, maybe 25 years ago, whenever we went to a Kathi or a Rajput family wedding, as we enter, the host would be standing with a little bit opium, and we had to take it, and then they would wash, the servant would be pouring, and then again next guest would come. So there was a big consumption of opium in many parts of India, Rajasthan and Saurashtra and everywhere. Now, so it was known that time, but in all probability it was introduced into country by Arab. Yes, I said this. By about 18th century, the British East India Company became a major player in the India-China opium trade. The complex story of opium, tea, silver moving in various circles is rather interesting. Opium, tea, silver. So, tea was very important. We thought, because from Bombay, opium was directly exported to China. But the British had a tea connection with it. Tea was just being introduced into Europe. And they were becoming so addicted to tea. everywhere. And the tea market of British was even bigger than all other earlier markets because it's all over. So, opium smuggling, next please. Opium smuggling into China, ruin of a brilliant civilization. China banned opium in 1729. China banned opium in 1729. Ignoring the ban, the British East India Company, who had begun large-scale opium production in Bihar and Bengal, employing nearly 1 million men, women, and children, exported 1,500 tons of the drug to China by 1830. Just imagine 1,500 tons of the drug to China, 1830 per annum, the value of which would be $1 billion a year in today's money. As observed by Henry Hobhouse, Henry Hobhouse was a sort of historian of commodities. It's very interesting to be a historian of commodities. And also botanist. The doping up of the Chinese population with opium demolished the material treasures of China and dispersed it all over the world. Museums, they all got Chinese treasures at that time because these people masses were doped, and a lot of Chinese antiquities and art and things, they got into Europe, treasures of China, and dispersed it all over the world, mainly the museums perhaps, while also eradicating the Chinese tradition. This is worse. Also eradicating the Chinese tradition of craft and design, turning them into copiers and coolies, where they lost everything. And look at this here, that these are Chinese they are eating living rats. This is a cartoon that appeared in one of the British magazines, and they are reduced to this kind of thing, and they had to still work in the factories, and they would fall down. There no energy left. Descriptions are amazing. And then they would take opium so they could complete the number of hours that they had to work in factories and things like that. This is what happened. In contrast, the money that came from opium, the lifestyle was different. Then these are company school painting. Farmers are coming to a British opium factory and bringing opium. The guard is standing there. Then it's packed for export, etc. And then opium was sent to China. It was banned, as I said. So it was illegal, so it was smuggled. So very special type of ships were built which had to remain in water for sometimes weeks and months. And therefore it has to be built in such a way that it doesn't get ruined. And then at night, because it was banned, it was all smuggled. All opium came to China was smuggled. So then with small boats, at night they were smuggled into China. I think that novel by... yes, yeah, Amita. That has some beautiful description, but this is otherwise also very well recorded. Next, please. Look at this opium. Each one is a ball of this size, opium ball. So look at this is a British factory collecting opium. The answer was opium. After the Napoleonic Wars, most of Europe faced the worst ever inflation. The tea imports from China, Britain's greatest commercial asset, began to face a disaster as the Chinese had no value for European paper money. You know, in France what happened, people went with bag full of paper money and could not buy perhaps a cup of coffee or whatever it is. So disaster, the Chinese had no value for European paper money. They accepted only gold, silver or copper. China had no copper. It came from Japan to them. So an answer had to be found, how to pay the Chinese for buying tea, because it was such a big business for the British. The answer had to be found, and that answer was opium. So, which had been the East India Company's monopoly in India since 1758. Opium monopoly, and you see in the picture how much opium. So, entire cultivation of opium, it's preliminary processing, turning into all these balls and things like it. It's all totally under the control of the British. The East India Company's bland hypocrisy began here. Each season, look at this, each season, the entire opium stock was cornered and auctioned in Calcutta by the company, East India Company. After which the company surreptitiously abstained from its direct trade with China. They did not take, they did not send. They were morally right. So you see in the picture here, the British officer weighing of opium, etc. So it was under strict vigil of the British, and the amount of opium. All this was under them. But then they let the local traders send it to China. And next, please. No, sorry. Please go back. Yeah, leave it there. The answer was opium. On the face of it, the opium stock was bought by the indigenous merchants who traded it. So Indians were involved in the trade. They sold it in auction, traded it with China in return of Chinese silver coins, which were then sold by the merchants of the East India Company. They were purchased. They were sold to the East India Company. The Indian merchants who brought silver from China were sold to were sold to the British East India Company. The Chinese silver was then sent to London and later handed over to the company's agents, leaving the port of London for Canton to buy tea over there. So you see how the surreptitious way this is. Again, so Hobhouse, the historian I mentioned, he writes, again the company could claim that they did not know that this silver was already dirty money obtained in exchange of opium. It was just a worked out system. It's an interesting system, and there's a lot of material, but I don't know for whatever reason, not much has been published as yet on this aspect. Next, please. Sorry, I have to drink water. In terms of quality, Malwa opium was much better than Bihar and Bengal opium. Parallel to the saga of the Bengal opium runs the story of superior Malwa opium, which was smuggled into China via Goa, Surat or Daman by the Bombay merchants, often with the help of Portuguese, to avoid being taxed by the British at the Bombay harbour. So, they took another route. This trade was largely in the hands of private leaders, private traders such as Jamsetji Jijibhai, Motichand Amichan, Framji Kawasji, Pestanji Mamanji, Muhammad Ali Roge, Roger de Faria, and many others. Most of them owned their own ships. Now it's interesting that the money that came was utilized for the development of Bombay city in many ways. So for example, you can see this Juma Masjid was built, supported by Muhammad Ali Roge, who was an opium trader. JJ School of Arts, you all know, Sir Jamsetji Jijibhai. Then this Jyotindra Jain temple, Motichand Amichan. And then also Avabai, Lady Jamsetji Jijibhai. You all know Mahim and Bandra Causeway was built. For this information, many other things, I'm thankful to my dear friend Virchan Dharamsi. Whenever I need something, I phone him, and he's such a storehouse of knowledge. So he drew my attention to this information and also provided me with these rare visuals of early JJ School of Art and all. As pointed out by the historian Amar Farooqi, I don't know if you know his name. Amar Farooqi is a leftist historian, and but he's a very fine historian. And he has published a book called 3 Lectures on Opium, extraordinary research. And I think even the novel in 3 parts, he has referred to Farooqi's work. So he says, Amar Farooqi, the destiny of Bombay as a great commercial center was born of its becoming an accomplice in the drugging of countless Chinese with opium. Modern Bombay, in a sense, has its genesis in poppy fields of Bihar, in a way, and it's in a way true too, though sounds a bit exaggerated. Next, please. Now I'm coming to the last 2, 3 pages. And um, as I said, my purpose is cultural fallout of all the three things. We saw fashion, we saw indigo and things. Now I'm coming to opium. Indian opium and the global diffusion. I'm very interested in this diffusion through Arab, through other things, and exchange of commodities and particularly exchange of ideas, fashion, lifestyle. Not great histories exist on that. Their trade histories are there, political histories are there, and of course there are references to cultural things. But very amazing things happen on this aspect. My intention this evening is to bring into focus the fascinating history of global diffusion of Chinese porcelain, silks, embroideries, and the entire chinoiserie aesthetics, at the basis of which was the Indian opium and Chinese tea trade. We all know about opium trade, but we must say opium and tea, that was the connection, mainly. How did the Chinese porcelain get introduced into Europe? How did the Chinese porcelain get introduced into Europe? And how? Not a few things, millions of Chinese, every aristocratic house in India, Southeast Asia, everywhere. How did the Chinese porcelain get introduced into Europe? Long distance voyages by look, this is a very interesting point. Long distance voyages by the cargo ships in the 17th and 18th centuries, before mechanized boats came or hydraulic boats came, needed to stabilize the ship's balance by carrying any heavy material such as sand in its bilge. At the bottom, they had to put stone or sand or something. Otherwise, the ships would lose balance. This unproductive ballast was replaced by Chinese porcelain at some point. So heavy, but tea was in the middle because it shouldn't get so close to the water. Porcelain initially for tea drinking, but even the porcelain came initially for tea drinking, but eventually for the whole range of domestic crockery, and then even large decorative vases, figures, and furniture as a part of increasing popular chinoiserie aesthetics in Europe and elsewhere. See, Chinese never drank tea hot. They didn't. They drank in a bowl, but Europeans prefer to drink tea in hot, and therefore they had to add I know the German word handle to that. So new kind of pottery, and that was also then made in China and exported and thing. And then that, you see, when I say chinoiserie, how almost every major European household had this Chinese style furniture and thing. Wallpaper was produced in China, these vases and all we know. And then in Indian aristocratic home, I think in Bombay, not perhaps, but perhaps never a house in Bombay which was somewhat economically well-to-do did not have Chinese porcelain and things in their homes. And this museum has Tata collection, which is, I think, one of the best in terms of that. Next, please. My last 2 pages. Euro-Chinese porcelain. A classic description of the hybrid chinoiserie would read, the willow pattern, you see this and 2 birds here, here also. The willow pattern was derived in England, look at this. The willow pattern was derived in England from a Chinese version of an English idea of a Chinese scene. The willow pattern was derived in England from a Chinese version of an English idea of a Chinese. This was the kind of cross-cultural effect of such trade. Chinese images were anglicized, European scenes were Chinified. The concept of European furniture, decoration, and textiles imitating Chinese designs came into fashion as a result of opium tea trade. So this is what my main part. Next, please. Bombay opium trade and the import of Chinese embroideries. On the other hand, the Indo-Chinese opium trade strongly impacted the sartorial culture of the Parsi community, especially the Parsi community, with their Gara sari embroidered, we all know, with motifs commonly found on the Chinese porcelain vases and jars. And this part I want to draw your attention to. This, like, you can read here, made in Germany. So eventually then the market became so big for the Chinese embroidered borders for Parsi Gara sari and things like that, that these all began to be manufactured in, particularly in Germany. Here there is, and here I think even it says Charni Road and Dubash, which is a Parsi. So importer was a person called Dubash and imported from Germany. This is all mentioned over here. But I'm saying that the whole culture had a relationship to China. Next, please. Yeah. Once again, the tables turned. By mid-18th century, European porcelain began to circulate all over the world. Because Europe could not make, this is very interesting, Europe could not make good porcelain. I think I finish in 3 minutes. Once again, the tables turned by mid-18th century, and Europeans could not make porcelain as good as, you know why? They didn't know the secret. So they made something like stoneware, very heavy, things like that, and was functional, but they couldn't get that kind of fine thing. Till they found out that the secret was mixing of what we call China clay, technically it's called kaolin, you know, the white clay, kaolin. The secret of the beauty of the Chinese porcelain lay in the use of kaolin, China clay, which was not known to Europeans until 1750. By when the Cornwall mines in England were discovered. Ironically, the tables turned soon after, and thence fine European porcelain began to be exported globally, including to China and India. So European. So now also these very homes which were dealing with opium and all that, they also had this kind of figures. Most of you will remember in their home they had figures like that. And then in Germany, for example, they began to produce in Meissen, which is the biggest center of porcelain production in Germany. They even began to make Hindu gods and goddesses, very light porcelain, thing like that. And there was a major export because hundreds of these figures have come out in Calcutta, from Calcutta homes. So this is what happened. And my last slide. Next, please. Yeah. Impact of the Euro-Chinese blue porcelain on Indian architecture. The Euro-Chinese blue porcelain became such a rage among the princes and the merchant princes of India that whole palaces were inspired by this aesthetic. And now you can see that this is the Chinese blue porcelain aesthetic. And then here there is a room in City Palace in Jaipur. This is Chini Chitra Mahal in City Palace in Udaipur, and this is Chini Mahal in Daulatabad Fort. This is all inspired by either in terms of painting or in terms of tiles that were produced. And in Shekhawati, also in Sikar, in Sikar, they have also a Haveli which is completely built like this in Shekhawati. So the story of global diffusion and ideas, that was my main theme. I was very worried that I'm doing 3 themes compressed into it, but not managed. But thank you very much for listening to me.